around Matthew chapter 28. Be a good place to be ready to follow along. Matthew chapter 28. We've been doing some studies on the local church, some things related to the attitudes we have towards one another, being united in peace and love and growing in the fellowship that we have and being devoted to fellowship. We've talked about different teachings related to the local church and the importance of these things and looking to understand these things, as well as we've been doing in these past couple of classes and talking about actions that we look to take as being a part of the local church, being one part of that one body or being one of the many members that are part of that one body, looking to help and encourage each other to glorify the Lord and do the work together. And so we're talking about these things. I will worship and grow, and I will serve. We finished up with some of that last week. But I do want to come up and talk about service a little bit more tonight. And then we'll talk about these phrases, I will go and I will give. We're going to kind of forego the I will make a difference. I don't think we necessarily need to have a whole section about this, but a lot of this is taken from a book that we talked about a couple of times by Thom Rainer, I Will, changing our thinking, reminding ourselves of the difference between I could go to worship, I should go to worship, I can give, I might, all these different things, from the attitude and the directive of I will be a part of the local church. I will take action. I will be one who serves. I will give. I will go. These types of things. And so we want to think about that perspective of things. And so I want to finish with what we were thinking about last week. We talked about how I will serve, seeing the example of service of Jesus, how Jesus is the model example of someone who is being a servant as he has left heaven and had every right to demand that people bow before him and humble themselves before him, and that he would be this kind of authoritarian figure. But rather than being that, he leaves the throne of heaven and comes not to be served, but to serve, as well as ultimately that being shown by giving his life as a ransom for many. And then thinking about that from Philippians chapter 2, the mind that we're supposed to have and following the example of doing so, and doing that service without grumbling and complaining, as Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. Just a couple of brief thoughts to fill with that, to finish up with the idea of being someone who will serve and being a part of service. First of all, I don't know if we got to explicitly make the point of you don't have to wait for someone to tell you. Definitely don't try to interpret my speaking in tongues. You don't have to wait for one of the elders to say, hey, we really need somebody to sign up for being a part of this building project, or we're really looking for somebody to do this. If there's something that you think of, I can serve in this way, and you know it's a biblical thing, go for it and build up the church and help somebody and bring the glory of the kingdom to honor God in that way, and take that opportunity and go for it. Now, if you're thinking, hey, maybe that bathroom's looking a little, I'm not trying to make any statement. So if you think I am, I'm not. But if you think that bathroom's looking old and you just rip out plumbing, you might be a little bit of trouble there. But take the opportunities as you see it and go with those things to serve and to help others. As well as in the book that I mentioned by Thom Rainer, he talks about the service experiment. This idea of, let's say there's about 50 people on Wednesday nights total between all of our folks out here, our teachers or so. If every one of those people chose to say, for the next few months, I'm going to devote myself to 1 week of service related to something related to the local church. I'm going to make food and take it to shut-ins. I'm going to write cards for people. That might be something that I spend some time on a Monday and some time on a Thursday, divide that up. And think about how you could have an impact within the church of that. If 50 people did that, a total of 50 hours per week over 12 weeks, that's 600 hours of service that's being done in the kingdom. Now, in the book, it's kind of framed as if your church leaders asked you to do this, and our church leaders aren't saying we're going to expect everybody to put in their hour of service this week. But it's a perspective of, think about, as we're finishing up some of these classes and we're talking about these things we can do to serve somebody by doing something in the congregation, by doing something for somebody in the congregation, by doing something for building up the congregation and going out and reaching people in the community in some way. Taking the opportunity to serve, an opportunity to build and to glorify our Father. So those were just a couple of thoughts we didn't get to talk about last week about service, of I will serve, and taking opportunity to do those things, and taking initiative and action, and being someone who will serve in the local body as well. So that leads us to this thought of I will go, and the subject of evangelism, some for this evening. So be with me, if you would, in Matthew 28, verse 18 through verse 20, and then Matthew chapter 5 as well. Let's start Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through verse 20. Brother Patrick, when you're there in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through 20, would you mind reading that for us, brother?
And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Thank you, brother. Here Jesus is very clearly giving that great commission, that part of it's not the only thing that the church is called to do, it's not the only work the church is involved in. But you think about it, if you were to give an answer of what is the mission of the church is to grow as disciples and to help other people to learn how to become disciples, to make disciples in this way. To go, as it's talked about there in verse 19, go and make disciples of all nations and teaching them to observe all that he has commanded. And recognizing as we do that, that seems like a bold and daunting thing, but the Lord is with us and helps us in that and encourages us in those endeavors. You think about the need for evangelism, the work of evangelism that's being done. We want to talk about that for the next couple of minutes this evening in the subject of evangelism. Let's add with this conversation Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through verse 16. And I think it works out well that our theme for this week in our cross-training series is sharing our faith or speaking our faith. And there are some thought questions related to that I think will build into some of our study for tonight. I want to use some of those as well as some of our other conversations too. But this is Matthew chapter 5. Let's go ahead and right here, verse 14 through verse 16. Let's read this together. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. After doing some reading earlier this week, if you're following the cross-training program we've talked about and doing some a little bit of reflection and somewhat, there's a question yesterday, what are some baskets that keep our light from shining in the darkness? And maybe pair with that this thought of some of the biggest challenges and obstacles to evangelism. Jesus' mission statement is very clear. Go and make disciples. There are passages that we see that reminder for that. There's great encouragement that we see that we'll talk about a little bit more tonight later on in our lesson. But sometimes evangelism can be that neglected area. This is one of those things, to borrow a phrase I saw, it's not meant to expose, to shame anybody here, but it's meant to be a wake-up call of this is our call as being a part of the body, is to help share that good news with other people. One of the places that we see that we'll get to a little bit is Romans chapter 1, how Paul talks about how I have this great need to preach the gospel to you, about the power of God unto salvation. I'm going to look at Barrett because I know he's at least said the quote before, but maybe you're familiar with the bread quote. What's the bread and evangelism quote, Barrett?
Oh, yeah. Evangelism is like one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. We're not the source of it, obviously, but we know where the bread is.
We know where that good news is. The good news is the gospel. It's the power. That's the power of God's salvation. It's not me or this place or this group of people. It's what God has accomplished through Jesus Christ. And we're the ones who have received that. If we receive that good gift, we want to share that message to other people who are needy and hungry for that message of salvation as well. I'm sorry to put you on the spot about that, but I knew you would know it, and that's why that's one of those things of, I know that quote's not original to Barrett, but for some reason, I'm always going to have his head and his wisdom radiating that quote there. Let me go back and let's get into the conversation of the questions here. Think about what Jesus says of letting our light shine. What are some of the biggest baskets that maybe get in the way from keeping our light shining? What are some biggest obstacles and challenges to evangelism? Let's open that up for conversation and get started tonight. Well, I got my back turned. If someone wants to start us off, feel free to just shout out. Was that Brother Ethan? Who was that? Time, Dylan? Talk about what you mean by time. Ooh, I like that. We think we're busy. I'm underlining it because I think it's helpful. there's truth. We have jobs, we have families, we have things we're doing in this life. But are those things that are so important that they take away from our time of fulfilling the commission that the Lord has given us? Those are things that should ponder and make us stop and think, well, if that's taking away my time from that, then there's a priority issue there with that. What else? What are some other things we can think about? This is Brother Ethan here. So I missed that up earlier.
I think we can be a little fearful with our jobs. Like, I did an internship a few years ago with the State Park Police, and part of the thing I had to do was a harassment training, and part of the harassment training was a scenario where a Christian was talking to a non-Christian, and they kept bringing up their Christianity, and they kept wanting to talk about them, and then when the person didn't want to talk about it anymore, he reported them to HR, and action was taken, and it was like you were given the scenario, and it's like, is this harassment? And I wanted to be like, no, but I had to say yes because that was the right answer according
to HR standards there with that. There's fear related to maybe at times in our workplace, in our employment. I know that we're, I think, luckily blessed to be where we are, where some things aren't as promoted, like things like Pride Month, and a lot of our teachers, as far as I know, don't have to deal with a lot of the things maybe some of the more secular groups or places, districts might do with some of that, but there's still some of that that's out there. Maybe some of our folks face some of that. It's Pride Month in June. It's time to wear the rainbow pin. It's time to eat the gay marriage cake. And you got to be involved in that. You got to support all of that. And there's a lot of pressure about how do we respond in that. And we might think, well, it's very easy to respond to that. Maybe we need to encourage and help and strengthen people in how they respond to that. But there's the fear with that. John 12 that I have up on the board, John 12, verse 37. This might not be what I'm thinking of, but John 12, 37, though he had done so many signs before him, they did still not believe him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, he has believed what we have heard from us, whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed. I'm looking for the passage in John that talks about how people, I'm looking for farther down, for verse 42, it looks like. Nevertheless, even the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it. They would not be put out of the synagogue. They loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. That was 42 and 43. Is that right? That's what I was trying to get a second ago. But fear is part of that as well. What else? Brother Tracy?
Your language. I know in the world I live in, you get a lot of anxiety, testosterone, a lot of things, and things get real intense. I think of my relationship with a referee or an official, and I lose my mind because you don't know what you get excited and you get angry or you're full of emotions, and it's easy to let your emotions and your frustrations hurt the light that you're really trying to shine. And I've done it. I've made errors in that realm. But my tongue can get me in a bind faster than just about anything else I can do.
Mm-hmm.
And over time you get better at it, but it's often difficult.
Our example and wanting to show the right example, but not always doing that. And times that we stumble in that, we need to acknowledge that, accept that, and look to make things right as we do that. But there are things that a damage is done in some way, and it can be hard to undo some of that damage then.
And on the reverse side of that, when you do it well, people notice.
Mm-hmm.
When you can lose your mind and be upset and under control, people see that. In the world I live, if a kid uses profanity or something, then I have to correct or discipline it. I make a big deal out of it, and I want other people to know that's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But when you can do it well, it is helpful.
A positive side, the reverse of that there being the example that we have, the reason for the hope on why I'm going to choose to be different from the people around me, even though it's a lot easier to just be like the people around me and to
And
be
not
on
let it
the
go.
same way.
You know, I can't let that go.
Yeah.
I can't.
Right. What about interest issues? And it might sound like I'm putting that backwards, but people just aren't interested in the gospel these days, are they? I have to be quiet and try to spell at the same time. Thank you. From here, in T-E-R, just like I had it the first time. I wasn't going to have to rely on Becca to let me down. There you go. Thank you. So, interest. People aren't interested in the gospel, right? Nobody wants to, or they've already got their own religion, so what's the point of all of that? There might be different levels of interest or varying degrees, but I'll get into some of our questions in just a second about making sure then that we try to figure out, well, how do we springboard those conversations? How do we keep doing what we need to do of sowing that seed, and for feeding that water as well? See, Brother Patrick, Sister Caitlin, and then I want to move it a little bit more, but go ahead.
Well, you brought up the interest part. I remember a long time ago hearing, oftentimes we have more suspects than prospects, because we suspect they're not interested. So I'm not gonna say, because I've already decided, I suspect they're not interested.
Mhm.
So why put in any effort? Instead of seeing them as a genuine prospect, we don't know if they'll be interested until they hear it.
I might be the only one who isn't, well, I'm familiar with it a little bit. Talk about what do we mean by prospect. I feel like that's an older term, but I think it's helpful. I might be the only one who might not know, but go ahead.
Yeah, so somebody that you're actively looking at, I'm going to try to share the gospel. I believe they're a prospect to become a Christian versus a suspect, well, I suspect they're not interested.
When we decide the person's not interested, even before we find out if they are or they aren't, and if they aren't, then we can still figure out how we try to move forward from that. But if we just decide, even before we start the conversation, what can be done? We're not trying to say that we're making things impossible, but it sure makes things difficult if we're not going to be the one who opens up there. Sister Caitlin?
Just being caught in your own personal bubble, like where you don't even know, and you don't like. Sometimes people are like, "Well, I prayed that God would listen to my life, and I can find the Bible." You're not just gonna drop them right in front of you. You aren't constantly like looking around you for somebody, and you're so caught up in like what you're doing today, or I'm gonna do this, that you forget to like look at what's happening around you. You're not gonna adopt.
We're going to talk about prayer, and hopefully prayer is one of those things that we see often connected with evangelism, and that we're participating in prayer and going to God in prayer often about that, and not just I pray about that person one time and I let it go. But to Sister Caitlin's point with that too is I prayed about that, and then I have active eyes and active ears and active minds to pursue those opportunities as well. Now, there are certainly things that only God can work on in the heart of a person. We can't change a person's mind or heart in ways that the Lord and the power of the gospel can. But we also don't want to, along with this, immediately think they're not up, then follow up with not taking action to help in ways that we're able to. Again, we can't force someone and compel someone to do that in the way that the gospel teaches us to do so, but we can still be actively interested in following along and following up in those moments. To tie up a lot of these, and there might be maybe others that are in your mind, some of those challenges, some of those baskets that keep our light from shining, I think one of the great reminders is to not let the enemy win, to not let Satan be the one who's going to be victorious in our perspective of evangelism, considerations of evangelism, to think nobody's there, to end up continuing to be a bad example, to be afraid, to give all of our time away to everything except for evangelism, to stay in our bubble. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11 came from our devotional this week. It was a reminder from our devotional this week that we read. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11. We think about the subject of evangelism. We think about the work of trying to reach souls with the gospel. The way it's phrased in Matthew of the gates of hell will not be able to prevail against the gospel. That the gates of hell that are trying to hold souls out of the kingdom, that we're trying to breach in to rescue, the kind of rescue mission operation thought there. So as we're trying to engage in these battles, engage in this war, 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 11 was a great reminder for me, a very great help for me, that we would not be outwitted by Satan. We are not ignorant of his designs. So don't be outwitted by Satan. When we think that someone's not interested and we try to just get that in our head before we get started, It's one of those things where we sometimes hear people say, not today, Satan. That's one of those moments we need to speak up and say, not today, Satan. I'm not going to make that decision for somebody before I have a chance to talk to them about the Lord. When I'm going to just sit back and not do anything about that following along, not today. I'm rather take action the way that the Lord wants me to. Pray for boldness, just as the first century church did. Think about how we can use our time. We may be busy, but how do we use even the time we're already busy in things to still reach people? That's our next question that I think is helpful. This comes from our stuff later this week. Colossians chapter 4, verse 5 and verse 6. And this reach out question, maybe a conversation you'll have with somebody even more, but thinking about how we can use this tonight. What have you used as a launch pad for spiritual conversations? When thinking about evangelism, obviously the ultimate goal is for someone to be united with Christ and to grow with Christ, to bear fruit in his kingdom, and for the glory of God to be shown in that way. But as we play our role in that, sometimes it's just those continual reminders along the way of the invite, the prayer, the action that we take. Colossians chapter 4, verse 5 and verse 6. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So what are some launch pads you've used to engage in spiritual conversations? One of those things of sometime along the way someone's going to hear, ask, what do you do? Well, I'm a preacher. Sometimes that changes the conversation drastically where all of a sudden things people were saying, they're not saying as much anymore. But sometimes if they hear that I'm a preacher, if I haven't brought up already first, and I'm not leading that conversation, at that point I'm trying to get into, hey, do you have a church home? Or do you have a church family that you're a part of? I'm at least starting that is church in your life? Is church on your radar? Hey, you do? That's wonderful. We still love to have come visit sometime and to join with us and to see what we're doing as we're talking about God's Word and growing. I think that we're trying to do as best we can being students of God's Word and help each other with that. Do you have a church home? Using that as kind of an open door for having a conversation about spiritual things. There are plenty, surely others. What other launch pads have you used to help have spiritual conversations with folks? Brother Ethan?
I was actually going to kind of mention this right before you started to move on, but and it kind of connects to like the personal bubble and the example a little bit of like you don't even like necessarily have to start the conversation. It can just be like the way that you conduct yourself throughout the day, like with like your coworkers. If you're spending a lot of time with your coworkers, you don't have to start a conversation with them for them to be interested in like talking about it. You can kind of just go out through your day, eat, or before you eat, you start praying, or the way that you conduct yourself, like with your language or with like your demeanor and everything. They're probably going to ask like, hey, why you act like that, or like, hey, I noticed you said a prayer before you ate. Like, what's up with that? Like, it doesn't have to be our initiation. Like, we should obviously want to if like we can feel like we can have that conversation with them. But if like you're kind of getting to know someone, you don't really know if they would be like a good person yet, kind of like that prospect thing. Just conduct the way that your life is, and if like you're stuck in your own personal bubble, then it won't. Like, if you're doing it correctly, then like your personal bubble will kind of be seen by others.
I haven't actually read 1 Peter 3, so it's probably important if I'm writing it and then arrowing it and then circling it that we at least read it for our class tonight. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. It may not be the only part of evangelism, and I think I would even go as far as to say hopefully it's not the only part of evangelism that's in our life, but a very powerful part, kind of related to some things Brother Tracy was saying already earlier, and a lot of what Ethan's saying right now too, is this passive start. And I don't mean that to be, that's not a negative thing at all in any way, but that's that fact of as we just live our lives, people see that. There's a difference between that kind of evangelism and kind of the more active, where we are kind of doing the instigating, we are doing the initiating in those. But this plays a part in some way, and so making sure that the passive part, so when they ask, or when they say, why do you do what you do, that's the launch pad. The launch pad is the character of our life, which is where we talk about the character, our life would be needs to match the content of what the gospel teaches as well. other launch pads that have been helpful for you, things that as you get into spiritual conversations with folks have been a good starting place. I'm not teacher blind and you, right? I mean, I'm double checking to see if there's other voices, but go ahead, Brother Tracy.
Dylan has brought this up before. When you have an opportunity to lead anything spiritually, you accept the opportunity. You know, I always told the story about when I was a young coach. I was intimidated and scared. The head coach asked me to lead a prayer, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. I was scared. I was nervous to run. I was in front of a lot of people. And I vowed then I'll never do that again. You know, if I ever have an opportunity to lead spiritually, I'm leading. And so just when there comes some opportunities from times in the secular world to do something spiritual publicly, you know, embrace the opportunity, I guess I would say.
To accept that light shining opportunity in that way.
And
There
it's
you go.
given to you.
I like that. What else? Sister Vanessa, is that a hand or is that you're just stretching along? Okay, good. Sister Caitlin?
Sometimes like just seeing people like out in public who like are at a coffee shop reading their Bible, and like I've several times just gone by and been like, I really like that you're reading your Bible, and that'll spur a conversation of like, oh, you go to church, and I'm like, yeah, like I go to church, and you can start a conversation off of that. But even just like seeing somebody in public who's reading their Bible, you can say like, oh, like I like that you read your Bible, like where you go to church is a good way to start a conversation.
I'm going to summarize with what Sister Caitlin is saying with my favorite thing to do in those moments. And I don't always do it, but I will often try to and pull a Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch. Hey, do you understand what you're reading in that moment? But there's that thought of, you're reading your Bible. How many times have you, maybe not everybody goes down to Silver Grizzly, but you ever gone down to Silver Grizzly and you see other people doing a Bible study, reading the Bible? Those are those things that engage that person a little bit. Obviously, there's interest there already, and you say, you know, that's wonderful to see you doing that. Maybe some encouragement of not everybody does that. And along with that, great question follows up, do you have a church home? Where do you go to church? This is where I go to church, and you know, we'd love to see you study the Bible with us sometime. But there's opportunity. The fish is in the boat in its way there. Speaking of fish in the boat kind of moments, when people come to visit, here, you know, those are times where rather than, oh, there's that new person, and we've talked before about kind of prioritizing visitors. Your people you're going to sit in the car with on the ride home and your family you're going to see in and out of your house all week long, you're going to see them all week long. That might be the one Sunday before the next year that person might potentially come back to Judson Road to go back and to make contact with that person. The fish is in the boat there. They're here at the building. They're interested in some way and follow up with, we're glad you're here. Is there anything we can do for you? Can I pray with you? Is there anything you'd like to study? Any questions you have? And in the few years I've been here, there's only been maybe one or two times someone's immediately led to that. But I'm always trying to make sure, you know, that that's the focus of, especially spiritual things. So do you have spiritual interests here? Do you have spiritual interests that I can help you with while you're at this place? And kind of taking opportunity of those. Continue to ponder that, think about that. Maybe talk about that with someone else in our reach out question later this week about what launch pads you use. And maybe I'll say as a reminder, part of these lessons are convicting to me of, I don't do this as well as I should, as well as I need to in that regard. And that's to my shame, and that's me to have this attitude then of not, I should go, or I could go, or I could go, but I will go. And think about ways that I'm not going to let things hinder me in this regard in the red, but more of the green and the blue of how I'm going to actively pursue. And the things to remember the power of prayer, continue to pray for God to work in the hearts of people we know. It may be that the evangelistic opportunity is the stranger, the cashier at Walmart who I haven't seen before in my life, and that's the moment right there. But oftentimes, who are the prospects, to kind of go back to that word, who are the prospects that we're probably most likely to have contact with, to reach out with? There are people we already know, our neighbors, our family, our friends. Continue to pray for these people that we know and to continue to ask God to work on their hearts. Remember the power of an invitation of, hey, I want you to go jump in water today. That's very different from, hey, we'd love to have you come to church with me sometime. Maybe in those kind of joking ways, I heard some preacher say recently, you know, somebody who he plays pickleball with regularly, hey man, when are you going to finally come to church with me? There's this thought of, I keep asking you, I keep kind of nudging you about here and there. We'd love to have you come. Just the power of an invite, and to think people of just one of the things that stops people from coming is they're never invited. You never invited me. There's that scary song that we sing sometimes, "You Never Mentioned Him to Me." It's one of those songs of, I don't like when the song leader picks that, but why don't I like when the song leader picks that? It's not because he's stepping on my toes, he's shooting me right here where I need to hit it. The final one there is the power of the gospel, like I mentioned already, and thinking about the power of the gospel from Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and verse 17. Let's read this text to close out this section. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and verse 17. Referenced in our devotional for this week from the cross training goes back to verse 14 of Romans 1. "I'm under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. It is the righteousness of God revealed from faith for faith. As is written, the righteous shall live by faith." And so when we're thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, there is pressure, there is work that we're called to do, there is involvement that we need to have, but we're asking people to respond to the gospel, something that has proven itself true again and again, has worked miracles and changed lives of people. Let's not doubt the power of the gospel. Let's definitely not be hindrances to the power of the gospel. Rather, to go, to shine our lights, to have the opportunity to encourage each other, to encourage me. I pray that y'all would encourage me to do that, to be this, as we move forward, continuing to be a part of that body here at Judson Road. Anything else about I Will Go before we move on? Any final comments you want to make, observations you have? Brother Barrett.
We worshiped with a guy, it's not fairly years ago, but he baptized his wife on that first day. So I'm pretty impressed with, because I think my style is more work things in when I can, but, so I guess, to me, I should challenge myself to maybe push more, push harder. But at the same time, I mean, a lot of people can't, like, that's not how they're gonna respond. So, I will go, I mean, it's like, there's a guy I work with that we've had multiple conversations, and it's just like a little bit of ground gets made, I feel like, and I think that's just the pace it can go. So I think some people can do either, and some people are better at delivering either, but some souls are only ready for either of those situations too.
We go. Two very important things that Barrett's mentioning. I'm glad that he mentioned them tonight. The one is that there's no silver bullet. If there was one specific silver bullet for evangelism, we would see the same thing, and Paul would just be machine gunning everybody he saw everywhere with that silver bullet of, you're going to be a Christian, you're going to be a Christian, you're going to be a Christian. Everyone's just getting shot down with the gospel in that way. But there's no one silver bullet in that regard, because not all people who are teaching the gospel, not all people receiving the gospel are exactly the same. There's different places in that. Number two goes back to Colossians chapter 4. Have wisdom with the time that we have, and think about, is this someone I'm talking to here? And I've been talking with this person for years, and they know what they need to do, and so I can push on them a little bit more? Is this somebody who they've come out of a church hurt situation, so that doesn't evolve them or dissolve them at all from being responsive to the gospel, to the word of God, but the way I treat that person is probably a little bit more gentle than how I push maybe on somebody? So that's part of the wisdom and part of the truth of Colossians chapter 4 we remember with that. Number one, the reminders of what we just heard of, there's no silver bullet. Number two, remember to seek wisdom in how we pursue our conversations with outsiders, and to be wise in how we treat other people. God help us with that. When we say that, when we say God help us, we're not saying that vainly. We're saying that with the full utterance of understanding that we need the Lord's help as we relate to other people and help other people. Number one, just by shining as lights and being a neighbor as the Lord calls us to. But number two, especially in opportunities we have to share the gospel with them. Anything else before we move on? We've got a few minutes here. I've already been talking fast tonight. Do I talk even faster and try to get 5 minutes of stuff in? I think what we'll do is we'll start with 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 7, and talk about a cheerful giver a little bit, and then we'll finish up by talking about a cheerful giver in our class next Wednesday. But let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 7. We've talked about it a few times in some of our recent classes. What hinders the I will action? Not the I will statement, but the action actually being taken. What makes us be I could, I should, I might, I can. What makes us have that? A lot of that comes from maybe a misperception about what the church is supposed to be, according to the teaching in the New Testament, when church is more of a country club that I pay my dues to and I expect the benefits from in that way. When worship or services are more about me being fed and me being serviced in some way, as opposed to this is a body that's in fellowship, in partnership, koinonia, one of those words we looked at early on, the attitudes we have toward each other. And so we are engaged and devoted to that fellowship. When we do that, that means that we're not just seeing I'm part of a club, but I'm part of the Lord's body, and I'm honoring the Lord and worshiping the Lord. Even the ways that we give. Yes, on the first day of the week, but even throughout our life as well. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 7. Brother Dylan, you got a Bible there with you right now? Can you grab 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 7 for us, please?
The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows bountifully will reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver.
Thank you, sir. I don't know how often places maybe still do, you have like maybe a Lord's Supper talk, and then you have a whole talk right before giving or the collection is taken up as well. But how many times has this passage been read before that? Can we say, first of all, how many times has this passage been read rightly before that and helping us to perspect our minds into the way it's supposed to be in that moment? Maybe how many times is that just, this is the rote passage I'm supposed to read, I'm supposed to be a cheerful giver, and so I'm a cheerful giver right now, but really it's just an outward perception of compared to what's going on in the heart. Paul talks about some things in here about, we're not supposed to, if we don't have ability to give, we don't have ability to give. And then earlier in chapter 8, he talks about there are times that you're the one in need and that you're not the one doing the giving, but there are times that you will be the one who's doing the giving and you'll help the others who are in need. And then when it comes to our giving in the local church, we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2, everyone sets aside in his heart what he's going to give and going to do so for the Lord. So we read that passage and we see Paul's point of we sow bountifully and we reap bountifully. And probably another one of those conversations is how many times do we hear that and see that when we compare ourselves to people in the world? I know before, was it from Zimbabwe? Who came from Zimbabwe a number of years ago? Joseph? Nelson, that's right. Nelson came from years ago. And I was before I was here, but I'm guessing that either from things that he talked about or things that the elders could tell you about that or about the Philippines, or Tyler used to go to Colombia, is that right? Or people go to Ethiopia, and you hear about all these third world countries and the difference between what we have and what we want and what we need, and what they have and what they want and what they need. We think about our bountifulness there. But what we're going to focus on, as we'll get into our next class, is thinking about how do we describe a cheerful giver, as well as the question that was in the sheet, if you still have one of those packets, is what's the opposite of a cheerful giver? And before you just put that into dictionary.com and say, what's the antonym of that, maybe ponder and think about that. What would the opposite of a cheerful giver be? And we'll talk about that next week. We'll talk more about what verse 7 says. Each one must give as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. If I'm a member of this one body, and I'm one of the many members that are part of it, and I want to be someone who's pleasing to God, someone that the Lord would look down and show favor to, not because I'm earning that, but show favor and being blessed in that way as I'm receiving God's favor or being shown God's favor as a cheerful giver, what does that look like? Let's pick up more there next week with that. So you got about an extra 47 seconds tonight, but we'll leave there. We'll pick up with these conversations next week of describing a cheerful giver, the opposite of a cheerful giver, the thought of we want to be those who are giving, not because we're forced to, but to the glory of the Lord. I don't know why I turned that off, because I'm not ready for that yet. But that's our class for tonight. Thank you so much for your presence, your participation this evening.